The rabbinic period is later. The rabbinic period is, officially late antiquity, 4th, 5th centuries, AD, onward into the Middle Ages. That's the rabbinic era. Obviously, there were rabbis around before that. But we're not talking about the rabbinic period with this material. We're talking about the intertestamental period, otherwise known as the Second Temple period. Named because it's the period between the building of the Second Temple, after the exile, to, again, in round numbers, 100 AD, but technically 70 AD when the Second Temple is destroyed. That's the Second Temple period. So the tail end of that is the era of the book of Acts. So there's an overlap at the end of it with the New Testament. So in that period, most of that period, of course, has a very Jewish, non-Christian orientation because we don't have Christianity yet. People are writing lots of things. They're trying to wrap their heads around God as a man. Is he Yahweh? Is he almost Yahweh, like mostly Yahweh? Or, sort of this Princess Bride thinking. Is he dead or mostly dead? They're struggling, and they're trying to come up with ways to articulate what they see in their Bible. And it's not a uniform discussion. It's a positive discussion. Nobody in this period who is a faithful Jew is thinking, we have to have this discussion, like in secret societies, because if we talk about this and get caught, then we're heretic. No, nobody's a heretic here. This is a legitimate theological discussion within the Jewish community until, again, the 2nd century AD. They're just trying to come to grips with, all these passages where Yahweh is presented as an angel or is associated with this angel, or he comes as a man, but yet there's still that other Yahweh in the same scene. What do we do with that? It's a very long, I think, fruitful discussion. So what they try to do is they're trying to do things like identify the Son of Man character in Daniel 7. Who is that? They are going to be saying things like that angel who is God, that must be a man, someone favored from the Old Testament that gets essentially sanctified or glorified. Some of them will say stuff like that. Or they'll say, well, that second Yahweh character is an angel from the Old Testament. That might be given a name or not. So they're going to be all over the place. They're just trying to figure out, how do we talk about this? So today, by way of outline, I'm going to go through the options, just give you examples of each option as they discuss them. Exalted humans, principal angels. We'll say a little bit about philos, logos. Again, it's the same word in the Greek New Testament. John chapter 1, beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. The word there is logos. So the Jewish writer Philo had a logos figure and concept as well. The memra, we'll say something about. Memra is the Aramaic word for word, just as logos is the Greek word for word. So the Old Testament was getting translated into the native tongue of Judea, which was Aramaic. Lots of people Jews could not read Hebrew. That was the language of the priestly class, the scribes and the Pharisees and all those kind of guys. The average Joe, could not read that, so they were dependent on Aramaic translations. And in those translations, called targums, there's some really interesting passages where the memra shows up, the word shows up as a character in different passages. We'll take a look at a couple of those. The angel and the spirit, and I have that together for a reason that will become evident when we get there, and then the spirit and the wisdom character. So let's go to the first one, exalted humans. And we'll start with Adam. There were some, again, we're just going through candidates in their mind about who the second power is. How do we identify the second power? How do we talk about them, this figure? So Adam was one choice, and the logic goes something like this. Well, Adam was the first man. He's the one closest to God's likeness. because Adam was created in or as the image of God. And so there was some thinking in this period about how while all humans are created in the image of God, there's some sort of like degradation process. And so like the best example would be Adam. So that was part of at least some Jewish theology. Certain writers preferred this. And again, they thought that this was a good precursor to making Adam an elevated figure to identify him as the second power. So in 2 Enoch 30, verses 11 and 12, and this is datable to the 1st century AD, so right at the end of the Second Temple period. This passage explicitly identifies Adam as one of God's chief angels over creation, just to give you a flavor for their thinking. It says, "And on the earth I assigned him to be a second angel, honored and great and glorious, and I assigned him to be a king, to reign on the earth and to have my wisdom." This is God talking about Adam. It's interesting to be a second angel. Okay? And there was nothing comparable to him on earth. Wisdom of Solomon, 1st century BC, so this is a couple hundred years earlier than that one, actually bestows a title upon Adam that elsewhere is the name of a creator deity in Hellenistic literature. Hellenistic era is the Second Temple period. Hellenism is when Alexander, 300 BC, using round numbers, conquered most of the known world and spread Greek culture all over his conquests. So in this period, some Hellenistic literature actually uses this phrase. This is Wisdom of Solomon 10, verse 1, referring to wisdom, which is a female character both in this book and also in Proverbs 8, and generally the book of Proverbs. Wisdom is cast as a woman because chokhmah is grammatically feminine. It's a Hebrew word for wisdom. It's the only reason. So she, wisdom, protected the first formed father of the world, who alone was created, and she delivered him out of his own transgression. So this is Jewish speculation on Adam's status after he had transgressed. He is the first formed father of the world. Adam is also elevated higher than a principal angel in the life of Adam and Eve, 1st century book, where Michael commands Satan to worship Adam, the image of God. There's a clear transition of thought here from Adam being created in the image of God to being the image of God. Do you catch that? That's important. So you can read your Hebrew Bible where Adam is created in or as God's image. But there will be Second Temple Jewish texts that refer to Adam as being the image, the visible representation even of God. So they'll take that image language used of Adam and they will turn it into a visual thing, and then therefore Adam becomes a candidate for these passages that we read about, we looked at last time, like the word of the Lord that shows up visibly. This is how, again, some Jewish thinkers get there. This is their thought trajectory to explain God in human form in their Bible. It must be Adam. Adam is the visual representation of God. Again, it sounds odd, but you can sort of see how they get there. It's kind of interesting, in the New Testament, there is resistance to worshiping any other heavenly being other than God and, of course, Jesus. But in intertestamental Jewish literature, you'll actually see that. You'll actually see a commendation to worship an exalted human. Why? In their minds, they're not worshiping men, they're worshiping this second figure from the Old Testament. So to them, it makes sense if you follow their logic in this case. Testament of Abraham. In that book, Abraham is shown a man, he sees a man in a heavenly vision, seated on a golden throne who has a terrifying appearance like the masters, like God's. Who is the enthroned figure? Well, the text answers that in verse 9. This is the first formed Adam. So there was this notion that if you went to heaven, you'd see Adam enthroned with God. And he becomes the second figure. Again, you just have to follow the logic trajectory and how they're trying to get there. Another exalted human, this one's kind of obvious, is Enoch. And the basis of this is Genesis 5, 22 through 24, where Enoch is taken, he doesn't die, he's taken to heaven. He walked with God, and God took him. So there were a lot of Jewish writers that thought, well, look at that, Enoch is sort of like eternal now, and he was favored by God, and he's in heaven. And you get certain books, First Enoch is one of them, who will transform Enoch, the guy who's taken up in Genesis 5, into a deity-like figure. And for them, Enoch becomes the best candidate for the second Yahweh figure, God made visible. You say, well, it might be difficult to see how that works with later figures like patriarchs or Moses. We're going to get to them. Both of these guys, Adam and Enoch, have this happen to them long before the verses that we read in the first hour. So they become good candidates for this God made visible guy. So here's 1 Enoch, 2nd century BC, 71:1. Thus it happened after this that my spirit, this is Enoch talking, passed out of sight and ascended into the heavens. And I saw the sons of the holy angels walking upon the flame of fire. Their garments were white, and their overcoats, and the light of their faces like snow. You get to the end of verse 2. Then I fell on my face before the Lord of spirits. So Enoch sees God. He falls on his face in God's presence. And I saw countless angels, with them the Ancient of Days. So you would expect to see the Ancient of Days. That's from Daniel. His head is white and pure like wool, and his garment is indescribable. I fell on my face, my whole body mollified, and my spirit transformed. And by the time you get down to verse 14, an angel comes to Enoch and greets him and said to me, "You, son of man." Now you see that. The writer of Enoch is taking the Daniel 7 scene where we have the Ancient of Days, and now who's the son of man? It's Enoch. So he gets to be that second figure, to whom all this dominion is given. And so there were a number of Jews that thought this is the best way to sort of explain that, this second deity figure, because only God's supposed to have control over everything. But in Daniel 7, it's the Son of Man. And the thrones were there, all this kind of stuff. Second Enoch, I fell down flat and did obeisance to the Lord. So kind of what we read in First Enoch in this scene. And the Lord with his own mouth said to me, "Be brave, Enoch, don't be frightened, stand up and stand in front of my face forever." God wouldn't say that to everybody. But if this is his most exalted other, like, his other, the other person enthroned with him, you could see him saying that to Enoch. The Lord said to Michael, "Go and extract Enoch from his earthly clothing and anoint him with my delightful oil and put him into clothes of my glory." So Michael did just as the Lord said to him. He anointed me and clothed me, and I looked at myself, and I had become like one of his glorious ones. So he is transformed into this heavenly figure who stands before God forever. The unusual thing here is that Enoch stands before God's, the direct presence, the panim, God's face. And you have this whole thing in Judaism about how no one can see the face of God and whatnot. That's mostly true, but here you have a text where Enoch, in the spiritual world, is exalted, and it's okay for Enoch to be in the direct presence of God. You say, well, is this like real theology or whatever? That's an extraneous question. What you're looking at here is how Jewish writers tried to really campaign for candidates, for the second power. They're giving you their rationale for why they think a particular person, in this case, would be elevated, and explain how God can be man and still God at the same time. Again, all these conversations. Again, Enoch is transformed in this way. Noah is another one. He gets described in ways similar to Enoch in different texts. In First Enoch, toward the end of it, Noah gets a nod, and there are people who believe First Enoch, and there's good reasons to think this, that First Enoch, the book of Enoch, is a composite document. Not all parts of it were written by the same people at the same time, and this might be an indication of that. But I threw Noah in here because the text is kind of funny, actually. After some days, my son Methuselah took a wife for his son Lamech. This is Enoch talking again. She became pregnant by him and bore him a son, and his body was white as snow and red as a rose. I don't know how that works. But the hair of his head, now catch the description. The hair of his head is white as wool, and his demdema beautiful. And as for his eyes, when he opened them, the whole house glowed like the sun. Rather, the whole house glowed even more exceedingly. And when he arose from the hands of the midwife, he opened his mouth so he can talk right away and spoke to the Lord with righteousness. And his father Lamech was afraid of him. Yeah, I guess I would be too. And he fled, he runs away, and he goes to Methuselah, his father, and said to him, I begotten a strange kid. It's like, this is kind of weird. He's not like an ordinary human being. Well, I guess not, given the description. But he looks like the children of the angels of heaven to me. His form is different. He is not like us. So again, they're propagandizing or campaigning for, in this case, Noah. There's something special about Noah. You say, well, they're just making this stuff up. Well, yeah, they are. You can't find this in the Hebrew Bible, but they're trying, again, to take things that you can see in the Hebrew Bible and do sort of interpretive strategies or theological strategies or just plain, reflections, theological opinion on certain characters in the Bible that they think might fit the template and then tell you why they prefer one over the other. The elements are pretty similar to the way Michael gets described in another text, Joseph and Asenath, in chapter 14 there. His hair is specifically described as the Ancient of Days was in Daniel 7. And this will become important later. The hair is also the specific description of the angel Yahoel or Yael. You'll see it both spelled both ways. You have an angel that bears two names of God, including the divine name. So we'll get to him in a moment. He becomes kind of interesting in this whole discussion. Jacob is a candidate for some people. Prayer of Joseph, fragment A, it exists in a couple of forms. Jacob, we read, I, Jacob, who is speaking to you, am also Israel, an angel of God. So Jacob, right there, is just made into an angel and a ruling spirit. I am he whom God called Israel, which means a man seeing from God, because I am the firstborn of every living thing to whom God gives life. Now, don't try in your head to wonder, well, don't they know where Jacob was born and what order in the biblical story? Okay, that doesn't matter to them. Just as you have Jewish writers say that the Torah was eternal, you have Jewish writers in this period say, well, Israel was eternal too. And Jacob was just the earthly manifestation of Israel. And in fact, Israel is the firstborn of every living thing to whom God gives life. They're going to make these interpretive twists. And it's bizarre. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But they're not really going to care. They're not going to care about your critique. Because they're going to have a way to sort of allegorize and get there. But the writer here is thinking, again, Israel is an eternal concept or something. It's something bigger than this one guy that shows up in the biblical story. God has an eternal son. Okay? Catch the logic? And for this writer, it's not Jesus, because we don't have, Jesus yet, at least in writing. This is in the first century somewhere. But the idea, again, of this sonship thing going on and the elevation, again, to this exalted supernatural status. These are Jews writing these things. I, Israel, the archangel of the power of the Lord and the chief captain of the sons of God. Where have we heard something like that before? The commander of the Lord's host. That's Joshua 5. So now we have Jacob as the captain of the Lord's host. This writer links the two. And that guy in Joshua 5 told Joshua what? Take your shoes off. You're standing on holy ground, just like the burning bush. So for this writer, the answer to all of that Yahweh as a man stuff is Jacob. Again, it doesn't have to make sense to us. You're just looking at how they're trying to come up with an interpretation. Moses is another candidate. On Sinai's peak, this is from Ezekiel the Tragedian, 2nd century BC. On Sinai's peak, I, Moses, this is Moses speaking in the text, saw what seemed a throne, so great in size it touched the clouds of heaven. Go to verse 73. I made approach and stood before the throne. And he, and we know who's on the throne, it's God, okay? He handed over the scepter and bade me mount the throne and gave me the crown. Then he himself withdrew from off the throne. Do you think the guy who wrote this was probably a good Pharisee that was a fan of the law? Well, you think it's Enoch, you think it's Noah or Adam. It's Moses. Again, they're all trying to one-up each other. It's part of the process. They all know that it's okay to have a second figure even spoken of in these terms. So the only question is, who's our guy? Who's our guy? Who do we want there? Who do we want to champion and why? Well, again, it's kind of obvious in this case because it's Moses and Torah. Now, other people thought, it says a little too much to try to get a human being in this slot. Let's just go with an angel. It's kind of an easier path. So Michael was the big candidate for many. He was considered by some Jewish writers to be Yahweh's co-regent in heaven, his co-ruler in heaven and on earth, because of his status in the Bible as the chief intercessor or the guardian angel of Israel in passages like Daniel 12. So Michael had a great appeal to a number of Jews just sort of out of the gate. And they imagined that position placed him nearest to God in authority. So again, that looked good. His name was suggestive, Mikael, 3 Hebrew particles there, morphemes. Me, who, the question, the interrogative, ka, like el, who is like God, ? And it's a rhetorical question. Okay. Michael plays the role of an eschatological warrior. In 1st Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's important because the commander of the Lord's host in Joshua 5 is a warrior. He's a commander of an army. Okay, so again, they saw a connection there. Michael was also considered by some Jewish writers to be, that's copied over. Let's go to the Testament of Dan, below that. In the 2nd century BC, draw near to God and to the angel who intercedes for you. Again, Dan is going to be part of Israel because he is the mediator between God and men. So this reference to the mediator between you as a member of Israel, a tribe here, again, this is the angel who intercedes for you, and he is the mediator between God and men for the peace of Israel. He shall stand in opposition to the kingdom of the enemy. Again, that's very consistent with his role as captain of the Lord's host, guardian of the people of God, Israel. So Michael had a lot kind of going for him as far as being a candidate. 1st Enoch 69. In that chapter, you get a list of the rebel watchers, gives their names and the specific sins they committed. It offers an explanation for how the watchers pulled off the rebellion. And this involved actually tricking Michael into revealing the divine name. So if you read that passage, there's a particular watcher who somehow is able to trick Michael into getting the divine name because there was this belief that if you knew the name of an entity, you could somehow control it or have power over it. It's ubiquitous in the ancient world, including Jewish theology here. But all that set aside, if you're trying to trick Michael for the secret name of God, you assume he possesses it. You assume it's his to guard or his to have or something like that. So whoever wrote, again, Enoch, is toying with this idea of Michael's superiority as well. Appearance of Michael to Abraham in the Testament of Abraham, first century. This one's patterned after the visit of the three men in Genesis 18, which turn out to be God and two angels. We find that out in chapter 19. We read this, though. Here's what a Jewish writer does with that story. Therefore, the Master God called his archangel Michael and said to him, Commander-in-Chief Michael, go down to Abraham and tell him about his death. So he changes the story a little bit there. So that he may arrange for the disposition of his possessions. So the commander-in-chief left the presence of God and went down to Abraham at the oak of Mamre, which is where the Genesis 18 story occurs. And he found the righteous Abraham in the nearby field. Again, so that's a different detail. I mean, they're using parts of the story to tell this story. Sitting beside yokes of plow oxen with the sons of Masek and other servants, 12 in number. And behold, the commander-in-chief came toward him. When Abraham saw the commander-in-chief Michael coming from afar in the manner of a handsome soldier, Abraham arose and met him. That line there is lifted right out of Genesis 18. Rose and met him. So here you have a Jewish writer taking elements of Genesis 18, which the wider Jewish community would recognize as Yahweh in the form of a man, and putting Michael into the story. They repurpose it and recycle it to make the story about Michael. This angel is not a biblical one, but it's sort of a famous one in this period. Yael, or Yahoel, in the Apocalypse of Abraham, 1st century A.D., Abraham is commanded to worship God in this particular scene. So this is chapter 17. And you get this long list of names given to God whom Abraham is commanded to worship. And some of these are biblical. Eternal One, Mighty One, Holy El, God, Autocrat, Self-originated, Incorruptible, Immaculate, Unbegotten, the whole grocery list. And you get down to verse 13, Eli, which is my God in Hebrew, Eternal, Mighty One, Holy, Sabaoth, the hosts, Most Glorious, El, Yah-El. You say, well, that's kind of weird. It is. It gets a little weirder. Because the same figure, Yah-El, appears in the life of Adam and Eve, another text from the same period. They, the angels, came to God and said, Yah-El, eternal king, command that fragrant incenses from paradise be given to Adam. So God is named Yah-El here. Catch that? Two texts where Yah-El is God. No question about it. Go one more. If you go back to the first source, Apocalypse of Abraham, you read this in another place in the same book. While I was still face down on the ground, I heard the voice of the Holy One speaking. Go, Yah-El, of the same name, through the mediation of my ineffable name, consecrate this man and strengthen him against trembling. The angel he sent to me in the likeness of a man came. Here you have Yah-El as a second character who shares the name of God and who is, he is God, he's Yah-El, and he is in the form of a man. He's in the likeness of a man. So this is a very clear Jewish statement of an exalted angel figure who is also God. This is a Jewish text. Again, nobody's writing, in their closet for fear of somebody, finding their book and sending them to jail or something. This is a normal discussion for literate Jewish religious thinkers and writers to have during this period. They are trying to get their guy, to the top of the heap, the one that they think is the best explanation for this. And so the passage continues. Stand up, Abraham, friend of God, who has loved you. Let human trembling not enfold you. For lo, I am sent to you to strengthen you and bless you in the name of God. So there's reference to God as a third person. Creator of heavenly and earthly things, who has loved you. Behold and hasten to him. I am Ya'el. And with me, Michael blesses you forever. So Ya'el is different than Michael. And since his name is Ya'el, he's a peg above Michael. Again, this is okay for them to do. If you had a Jew write this stuff today, okay, he's going to get thrown out of yeshiva. Because you don't do stuff like this. You just don't do stuff like this. Today it's going to be perceived as a violation of the Shema. Now, Philo's Logos. Philo says of the Logos, again, Logos is a literary figure and a theological figure, a theological construct for Philo, who is we'll go back to the slide. This is his period. I mean, he is going to be contemporary, a little bit before the time of Jesus and then during the time of Jesus, so 20 BC to 50 AD. And he says things like this. These are just snippets. God sustained the universe to rest firm and sure upon the mighty Logos, who is my viceroy, my co-ruler, my vice-regent. The Logos is the co-ruler with God. The Logos is that power of his, power of God's, by which he made and ordered all things. Doesn't that sound like the New Testament? 1 Corinthians 8, you got Romans, I think, 11. There's part of that. Colossians chapter 1. Jesus is the agent of creation. Okay, Philo has the same language, and he's actually referencing the Logos as this figure. While God is indeed one, Philo writes, his highest and chief powers are two, goodness and sovereignty. And in the midst between the two, there's a third which unites them, the Logos. For it is through the Logos that God is both ruler and good. So in other words, the Logos possesses attributes of God. And it's just kind of odd. You don't expect Jews to write this kind of stuff. Philo refers to the Logos as God, a handful of times, but here's one of them, theos, normal Greek word for God. He also refers to him as Deuteron Theon, the second God. Okay, that's a pretty dramatic thing to say for a Jew in the first century. Okay. Philo also refers to there being two gods, which becomes a synonym for the two powers in Jewish thought of his day. And Siegel comments on Philo's use of the Logos and whatnot in his book, The Two Powers of Heaven. Again, this was acceptable Jewish theology for the day, for the time. And if we were back at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and I'm going through stuff like this, I'm going to have a little Jewish guy sit there in the front row and say, my rabbi never taught me any of this. No, he didn't. And he wouldn't dare to. And I'll go even further than that. He probably doesn't know. Because when you train as a rabbi, you're doing stuff like Talmud and Mishnah. You're not reading Second Temple texts. You don't really care about the history of thought, within your own community. You care about, it's kind of like with Catholicism and the priesthood or some other denomination that has a real, I use Catholicism because of canon law. Okay, there's a body of tradition that becomes core to the identity of that person, that priest. You have to be really familiar with that stuff. And that's what you focus on. You're not doing biblical studies. I mean, I've met people who have, either are in the priesthood or were in the priesthood and left, and it's like, we had 3 hours of Bible in seminary. Just like they don't get that. They get canon law, they get liturgy, they have to learn all that. They got to learn the hierarchy, the ecclesiastical structure. There's a lot to know. There's a lot to know. They're not focused on this. And, in rabbinical tradition, you have to be familiar with what the rabbis were saying. They're commentators, and they're important commentators in your tradition on the Bible. They can read Torah. They can read, Hebrew Bible just fine. But that in and of itself doesn't mean a whole lot. Like I've said before, and various lectures. You shouldn't get enamored with people who can read Hebrew. It's kind of neat. Yes, it's fun to do. And yeah, like with Genesis 48, if you know the grammar, there are things that just jump out at you, and that's all good. But if I went to Israel today, I could pull a 6-year-old off the street who's a native speaker, and he can read the Hebrew Bible better than I can. I don't want that kid interpreting it for me, okay? But he can do it. He can do it because it's his language. But that's all it means. So, you have to have, if you're going to be discovering this kind of stuff, and what you're getting exposed to here, in a yeshiva setting, you're not allowed to talk about this. If you run across different passages that are kind of like odd in the Hebrew Bible, you need to read that text with or in consultation with a rabbi of a certain stature so he can explain it for you. And the tradition is all going to be stilted against two powers thinking because it's been that way since the 2nd century. What would you expect them to say? Now, you can get Jewish academics who are not, tied into a particular wing or sect or subculture. In other words, they don't really care. They're like academics today who might be Christian. Maybe they take it seriously, maybe they don't. Who knows? But they're more free to talk about, to think critically about Scripture than somebody who's a pastor of certain congregation. That's just the way it goes. It's the same thing in the Jewish community. Philo, elsewhere on the Logos, Philo was clearly writing for an audience of Jews devoted to the Bible. He's not writing to people who don't care. He's writing to people who care about knowing and interpreting their scriptures. For one branch of pre-Christian Judaism, at least, there was nothing strange about a doctrine of deuteros theos, the second God, and nothing in that doctrine that precluded monotheism. Now, this is from Daniel Boyarin, one of those Jewish academics I just referred to. I've seen Boyarin. He wears a yarmulke, so I think he's committed to some level of seriousness to his own faith. But this is a well-known article in Scholarship, Harvard Theological Review, The Gospel of the Memra. Now look at the wording, Jewish binitarianism. That's a Godhead of two. Jewish binitarianism and the prologue to John chapter 1. Oh, this is a good article. Okay, because Boyarin his field is rabbinics. He's sort of in the same circle as Siegel. They're really well tuned in to the discussion prior to the 2nd century about the second power. Siegel's no longer with us. Boyarin still is. I don't think he's retired yet, but his stuff, again, if you're interested in this, Boyarin's stuff is good to get, especially this article, because he's really zeroed in on the Gospel of John. And you can see from his conclusion, it's like, this should be no big deal. And at least at the time, it wasn't a big deal. He's just honest. I mean, you appreciate scholars who are just, yep, that's the way it is. Then whether they believe it or not is a different question. I don't know where Boyarin's at in any of this, but he's honest. So he says in another place, for Philo, the Logos is both a part of God and also a separate being, the Word that God created in the beginning in order to create everything else. The Word that both is God and therefore is with God. Again, he's trying to link Philo's Logos idea and see where it aligns, and also in the article where it doesn't align, with what John is writing in John chapter 1. And basically he's going to conclude, look, John and Philo, they would have gotten along. They're part of the same period. This is a legitimate discussion to have. They would have gotten along. One's not going to call for the burning the stake of the other, Let's go to the Memra. Just as logos is the Greek word for word, okay? So Memra is the Aramaic word for word. If you're interested again in this topic, specifically the Memra, this is the book to get. This is put out by, I think, Hendrickson, which is a Christian publisher. I don't know John Ronning. If he's publishing with Hendrickson, he's probably a Christian, a believer. The title says it all, The Jewish Targums in John's Logos Theology. It's paperback. Again, it's actually affordable. Now, Boyarin, I'm going to go back to Boyarin for the Memra. He says, there were other Jews, and moreover, not only Greek-speaking ones, who manifested a version of Logos theology. So that's an important sentence because a lot of other scholars, the guy's talking about this two powers, the binitarian thing. They're influenced by Greco-Roman thinking. And Boyarin's like, no, not so much. Okay? Not so much. There are other Jews, again, not only Greek-speaking ones, who thought this way. They had their own version of Logos theology. Notions of the second God as personified word or wisdom of God were present among Semitic-speaking Jews as well. The leading candidate for the Semitic Logos is, of course, the Memra of God, the Word of God. So if you go back to Genesis 19:24, this is what one of the Targums does with it. Remember Yahweh raining upon Sodom and Gomorrah, sulfurous fire from Yahweh? In the Hebrew text, it's the four consonants in both places. In the Targums, it's not. And the Targums are translating the Hebrew text, ostensibly, but this is an interpretive translation, very obviously, because they take the first one and they make it the Word. The word of Yahweh, the Memra of Yahweh, was the one who rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah, sulfurous fire from Yahweh. They do this all over the place in the Targums. They insert the Word, who is but isn't God, in all sorts of passages. If it sniffs at all, smells at all, like we've got a binitarian thing going on, you can bet the Memra is going to show up somewhere in that passage. Again, that's how they're not cheating, they're interpreting. They're recognizing we've got two figures here. And it's easier for them to just refer to one of them as the word of the Lord. So it creates a distinction, but yet it's sort of still the same. And so John's a Judean, okay? He is going to be exposed to the Hebrew Bible in his native translation of Aramaic. He's going to be very familiar with the Memra way of thinking about the text and about God. Which is really significant when he begins his own gospel. The beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. And then you get down to verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He knows exactly what he's talking about. He knows he can go to the Hebrew Bible for this idea, God is a man, and he can go right to his own translation tradition in his own language. What's the problem? What's the problem? The point for us is that it's not foreign thinking to them. Before I hit the angel and the spirit, the fact that it's not foreign thinking is actually important today for apologetic reasons, okay? You can go to YouTube, and yes, I will say, watch me rather than Bart Ehrman, okay? All right? But Bart Ehrman is, and it's not only Bart, it's other scholars as well, who want to argue that the New Testament ideas that Jesus was God in the flesh, the deity of Jesus, they will argue that that is late in the New Testament. Now, when it comes to Easter time, you're going to be at the grocery store and you're going to see the magazines, about Jesus on the impulse shelf. And they're all going to say the same thing. Well, who was the real historical Jesus? As opposed to the Christ. See, when you create that distinction between the historical Jesus and the Christ, this is exactly what you're doing. You're saying, well, the guy who actually lived in the first century and did and said stuff, that's one. But then these ideas that accrued to him that made him God, that was beyond the first century time period that Jesus actually lived. Those ideas were added by his disciples to make him into this, deity figure. And the Christian Trinitarianism, therefore, really isn't rooted in the theology of the first Christians. Pardon. Okay? That's skipping all of this discussion. It's like it never even happened. Okay? That's just not legitimate methodology. Let's just be honest. Let's say it did happen. It doesn't have to be late. It's not late. And if you don't want to believe it, fine. But don't lie about the historical process. Just don't lie. Tell us where you're at, but don't lie. It shouldn't be that difficult, but I guess it is. Now, in the Old Testament, again, this is no surprise, Second Temple literature and the New Testament, all three bodies of literature, Old Testament, Second Temple, New Testament, members of the heavenly host, angels, if you will, are identified as spirit beings. It's kind of a no-brainer, all right? Giving you lots of intertestamental references for that and some Old and some New Testament stuff. That is pretty elementary, but it's important as a backdrop to some other things. At Qumran, this is where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, the angelic Prince of Lights is identified as the angel of his truth and the spirit of truth. Now, I start here because if you read a passage like that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can already tell that Jews are thinking of the angel, the second Yahweh figure, as the Spirit. Ooh, now we've already seen how Jews are thinking of the second Yahweh figure as a man, but now they're thinking of it as the Spirit as well. And what's the source for that? What might be the source in the Hebrew Bible for this? Yeah, I'm cutting lots of detail out, but here we go. Isaiah 63. I will recount the steadfast love of the Lord and the praises of the Lord. So we're asking the question of why would they ever think of linking the Spirit and the angel and God? Why would they ever think of all three of these? According to all that the Lord, there's the divine name, has granted us, and the great goodness of the house of Israel, that he has granted them according to his compassion, according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he said, surely they are my people, children who will not deal falsely. And he became their Savior. So the Lord became their Savior. That's nice. In all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. So if you stop right there, you've got sort of the Exodus narrative. You've got God and then this special angel that God told Moses about. Don't cross him because he's, my name is in him. Okay, you got the two characters kind of straight. In his love and in his pity he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them all the days of old. But they rebelled and grieved his Holy Spirit. Therefore he turned to be their enemy and himself fought against them. So the Spirit is introduced into the discussion. And if you look over at Psalm 78, which is about the same scene in the Torah, it's basically the scene where they complain. And I know there's lots of those, but they're in the wilderness, on the way to the promised land, and they have these episodes. And again, if we had my software open, you could just colorize the Hebrew words and see where they show up in all these other passages. We don't have time to do that, or the utility. But here in Psalm 78, we have a reference to the Most High God, their Redeemer. They flattered him with their mouths, they lied to him with their tongues, so on and so forth. He was compassionate, he restrained his anger, he remembered they were flesh. And then you go down to verse 40, and the reason I have the colors here is that the yellow, the orange, and the green, okay, yellow word is the same Hebrew word in both passages. Orange word is the same Hebrew word in both passages. But in Isaiah 63, the one that is rebelled against and grieved is the Holy Spirit, and here it's God. So Spirit, Holy Spirit, Spirit of God, God. Do I have to pick? Well, not really. Again, no scribe comes along here in Psalm 78 and says, we need to make it clear that the Spirit of God isn't really God. No, they don't care. Okay, they don't care. It's not an offense. You get the same thing kind of going on in Ezekiel 8. Then I looked, and behold, this is Ezekiel's the speaker, a form that had the appearance of a man. Below what appeared to be his waist was fire, and above his waist was something like the appearance of brightness, like gleaming metal. Where have we seen that before in Ezekiel? Chapter 1. The wheels, okay. This is the description of the divine man sitting on the throne in Ezekiel 1. But here we are in Ezekiel 8. So we have this form, the appearance of a man, get the description. He put out the form of a hand and took me by a lock of my head. And did he lift the prophet up? No, the Spirit lifted me up. So, okay, what's the writer's point? Why would he take him by the lock of the head if he didn't intend to lift him? I'm going to lift you by some other means, but I just like grabbing your head. I kind of like that ponytail. No, just think about it. This blends a reference to the Spirit with the anthropomorphized God of chapter 1. And they're not just doing it to do it. And the scene, comes, it keeps going. The Spirit who lifts him up, but it should have been like the man who lifts him up, but anyway. He gets to the entrance of the gateway of the inner court that faces north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there. So now you got the anthropomorphized deity early in chapter 8. You get the Spirit, but God's over here. How does that work? They're used to the multiplicity of the language. This is not a New Testament invention. And now we've got the Spirit sort of entering the picture in the Hebrew Bible, but he's also going to enter the picture in the Second Temple period. And the New Testament is part of that. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Rise and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza." This is a desert place. This is Acts 8, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. We're familiar with the story, but we miss details like this. Verse 28, the eunuch is seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah, and the Spirit said to Philip, "No, wait a minute. I thought the angel of the Lord was talking to Philip." But here it's the Spirit. And isn't the angel of the Lord God in our Bibles as Jews? Like, what's going on? Now we got the Spirit to worry about. In that passage, it's kind of interesting. The Spirit said to Philip, if you know a little Greek, or if you know a little English grammar too, in the red circles there, the word the and ta, that's the article, the neuter article in Greek. So it's the Spirit. It's not just a spirit, like any spirit. It's the Spirit. It's intentional. It's a way to just express through grammar that you don't want you don't want the net widened. Okay? You don't want the net widened. The Spirit and wisdom. Now, if they were thinking about the Spirit as a God-level person, not just like an attribute of God, but like God-level person, that becomes an issue when you get into the wisdom stuff. Okay, in both the Old Testament and, of course, it's going to drift over into Christology. Genesis 1:1-3. Who or what is God's agent or means of creation? Well, for a lot of Jews, It was the Spirit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So a lot of Jews and a lot of Christians, this isn't new to a lot of Christian thinking, that the Spirit of God has some role at creation. Okay, just because of the reference here. I start with that because that idea has a history that a lot of Christians aren't aware of or don't quite see, but you get it, you're going to see it in Jewish thinking, both in the Old Testament, elsewhere, and then in the intertestamental period. So let's talk about wisdom, and then we'll see how the Spirit from the Spirit creator sort of gets merged with or overlaps with the idea of wisdom in this passage. Now, who or what is the agent of creation in Proverbs 8? Again, if you asked the average Jew, who's the agent of creation, God's means of creating in Genesis 1, they're going, the Spirit. He's right there hovering over the waters, and then they get to work. If you say, well, who is it in Proverbs 8, you're going to get wisdom because of this passage. The Lord possessed me. Different translations have brought forth, created, or formed, and we can talk about the word a little bit later. Maybe I'll think of it. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Now, in Proverbs 8, if we went through and read the whole passage, wisdom is a character there, referred to as a woman. Wisdom is a female character throughout the book of Proverbs. She's the wise woman as opposed to the woman of folly. Okay, wisdom and folly are personified as two female characters in the book of Proverbs. So wisdom is talking about herself here. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. Before he had made the earth and with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world. So basically, if you stopped here, it's, well, wisdom, God is creating the earth with wisdom. Well, no kidding. I mean, God has to have some smarts to do this, all right? When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle in the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, there I was beside him like a master workman. See, wisdom is personified. There's female references in Proverbs. There's personification here. It's like wisdom is a figure, like a person. That says, yeah, when God got down to creation, I was there. I was there with him. Now that's Old Testament, and Jews noticed this. Wisdom was the agent, but who or what was that? Who was wisdom? Wisdom of Solomon. This is a book from the Apocrypha. I will tell you what wisdom is. Again, this is a Jewish writer. How she came to be. And I will hide no secrets from you, but I will trace her course from the beginning of creation and make knowledge of her clear, and I will not pass by the truth. For wisdom, the fashioner of all things taught me, for she is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore nothing defiled gains entrance through her. She is a reflection. This is a text written in Greek. It's apogasma, which is going to show up in the New Testament in a real interesting place. She is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9. O God of my ancestors and Lord of mercy, who have made all things by your word, and by your wisdom have formed humankind to have dominion over the creatures you have made, and rule the world in holiness and righteousness. God's just smart. Well, look at verse 4. Give me the wisdom that sits by your throne. That's a little different. That's anthropomorphic language, pardon, of this female, figure of wisdom. Give me the wisdom that sits by your throne. That's the one we're talking about. In Sirach 24, another apocryphal book, Jewish book of the Second Temple period, wisdom praises herself and tells of her glory in the midst of her people. In the assembly of the Most High, it's divine counsel, she opens her mouth, And in the presence of his host, she tells of her glory. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist. I dwelt in the highest heavens. In the Hebrew Bible, who dwells in the highest heavens? That would be God. Okay? And my throne was in a pillar of cloud. Who's in the pillar of cloud in the Old Testament? God, maybe the angel. Okay. Alone, I compass the vault of heaven. Who does that in the Hebrew Bible? Again, the point is God. These are phrases used of God himself in the Hebrew Bible. And traverse the depths of the abyss, over waves of the sea, over all the earth, and over every people and nation I have held sway. I'll tell you this. By the time you hit the New Testament, the angel and the Spirit were getting talked about, interchanged in the minds of Jewish writers. The Spirit and wisdom were also getting interchanged. And both were the co-creator, the agent of creation, in the minds of Jewish writers. Now, lots of Jews had their favorite candidates, exalted human, special angel, and those are important. But some had the Word in mind, the Memra, the angel, the Spirit, wisdom. All of these are candidates. And the really interesting thing is the New Testament writers will link Jesus to every last one of them. And that's intentional. You say, well, how does that work with some of this wisdom talk? Okay, we'll see that in the next session.